528 bodies crossed the line of contact in sealed international Red Cross bags. And what that number reveals about the actual state of the war in Ukraine is more devastating than any frontline map published in recent weeks. It is the largest repatriation of remains since the conflict entered its phase of industrial attrition. And it happened on the same day Volodymyr Zelenskyy stepped to the podium in Kyiv to promise what he called a brutal and proportional response to the scale of the Ukrainian sacrifice. 528. Consider what that number means in practice. It is the equivalent of an entire infantry battalion, a complete operational unit, returned in the form of bodies identified by DNA, fingerprints, and dental records. In previous wars, repatriations of this magnitude took months of diplomatic negotiation. This one took 16 days, mediated by the International Committee of the Red Cross, under conditions both sides described as urgent. The urgency was not humanitarian, it was arithmetic. The equation had shifted. What made this repatriation different from all previous ones was not the volume, though the volume was, in itself, a datum of civilizational scale. It was the context in which it occurred. In the weeks leading up to the exchange, the Ukrainian armed forces had intensified long-range drone operations against Russian logistical depots deep inside Russian-held territory, striking rail terminals in the Belgorod region, ammunition warehouses in Voronezh, and according to reports from the Institute for the Study of War, the ISW, at least 2 operational command centers in the rear of the Russian grouping in the Donbass. The Russian response came in the form of saturation bombardments, using Iskander ballistic missiles and Shahed drones against Ukrainian energy infrastructure, in attack cycles lasting between 3 and 5 consecutive days. And between those cycles, bodies accumulated on both sides of the line of contact at a rate neither military bureaucracy could process. But the true impact of this repatriation extended far beyond the battlefield numbers. There was a dimension the headlines were not capturing, and it changed the nature of the analysis entirely. The cost of each repatriated body was not only human, it was fiscal. According to estimates from the Ukrainian Ministry of Finance published earlier in the month, the Kyiv government was allocating approximately $4,200 per fallen soldier in immediate compensation to families, a figure that multiplied by 528 represented more than $2,200,000 in direct expenditure within a single repatriation cycle. For an economy operating with a budget deficit of 28%, meaning it spent nearly a third more than it collected, financed almost entirely by external aid, each mass repatriation was simultaneously a moral imperative and an accounting hemorrhage. And this paradox was not accidental, it was structural. The paradox had closed in on itself. Zelenskyy knew this when he stepped to the podium. The promise of a brutal response was not domestic rhetoric, or not only that. It was a signal calibrated for 3 simultaneous audiences. For the Ukrainian population, which needed to hear that the sacrifice documented in those 528 bags would not be squandered in premature negotiations. For Moscow, which needed to calculate that escalation would carry a direct and measurable operational cost. And for Washington, Berlin and London, which needed to understand that Ukraine would not accept a ceasefire that converted those bodies into diplomatic bargaining chips without verifiable territorial reciprocity. And here was the actor that the headlines were not mentioning with the frequency that the data deserved. The International Red Cross, the institution that mediated the repatriation, was operating under simultaneous pressure from both sides to accelerate the process, but for diametrically opposed reasons. For Ukraine, the speed of identification and return was a matter of domestic legitimacy. Families waiting months for confirmation of death represented measurable political erosion in internal polling. For Russia, acceleration served a different and more cynical purpose. Each body returned quickly was a body that did not need to be recorded in the official casualty lists the Kremlin continued to deny publicly. The Red Cross, therefore, was not a neutral actor in the operational sense. It was an instrument that both belligerents were using for opposing political ends through the same humanitarian mechanism. In a moment, you will understand why that detail about the instrumentalization of the Red Cross changes the strategic calculus in ways neither side had anticipated. Colonel Dmytro Kovalenko, a Bakhmut veteran with artillery shrapnel in his left shoulder and 17 consecutive months of frontline command, was among the officers assigned to the reception ceremony for the bodies in Dnipro. This man is not the emotional protagonist of this analysis. He is the precise coordinate of what the war of attrition consumes. Field officers with irreplaceable experience, temporarily pulled from the line to manage the dead, in a cycle that feeds the very machine that produces them. The historical analogy that captures this dynamic with the greatest precision is not the First World War, though the trenches and industrial attrition invite that superficial comparison. It is the Iran-Iraq War between 1980 and 1988, a conflict in which both sides sustained massive casualty rates for 8 consecutive years without either managing to impose a definitive military decision, in which body repatriations became first-tier domestic political events, and in which demographic exhaustion, not military victory, ultimately determined the moment of negotiation. Iran accepted the ceasefire in 1988, not because it lost a decisive battle, but because the accumulated cost of 800,000 casualties had eroded its recruitment base to the point where continuation had become operationally unsustainable. According to consolidated estimates from analysts at the Royal United Services Institute, the RUSI, Russia was approaching 700,000 casualties between killed and wounded, a number that corresponds to the entire population of cities like Stuttgart or Marseille, erased from the list of combatants in less than 3 years of war. Russia cannot sustain this hemorrhaging indefinitely, and the end of that period will determine the future, not of one country, but of all of Europe. Step back for a moment and look at the full picture. Zelensky's promise of a brutal response did not exist in a strategic vacuum. It came during the same period in which the Ukrainian parliament was debating the extension of the mobilization law, the compulsory call-up of citizens for military service, which had already lowered the minimum conscription age from 27 to 25. Each mass repatriation simultaneously fueled the argument in favor of broader mobilization, because it demonstrated the scale of the sacrifice required, and the argument against it, because it demonstrated that the mobilized were dying in proportions that called into question the operational effectiveness of newly formed units. The cost of training and equipping each new Ukrainian soldier stood, according to estimates from the British Ministry of Defence, at around $42,000 per combatant by the time they reached minimum operational capability, an investment lost entirely each time that soldier appeared in a Red Cross bag 16 weeks later. And here was what that layer about the instrumentalization of the Red Cross revealed. By accelerating the repatriations, both sides had inadvertently created a transparency mechanism that neither fully controlled. Each mass cycle of body returns generated numbers that independent journalists, human rights organizations, and open-source analysts could cross-reference with satellite imagery of cemeteries, civil registries, and social media posts from family members. The result was a parallel accounting of the war that operated outside the narrative control of both the Kremlin and Bankova, the Ukrainian presidential headquarters. And that parallel accounting was becoming, week after week, the most reliable source on the actual state of the conflict. The archive was growing, and archives have no expiration date. In the shadow of this monumental strategic miscalculation, having accelerated a mechanism that was now exposing their own losses, one actor was watching everything with calculated satisfaction. Beijing was tracking every repatriation, every published figure, every data point on Russian demographic attrition with the precision of those who plan decades ahead. Each Russian body returned by the Red Cross was, on China's strategic spreadsheet, one more data point confirming that Moscow would emerge from this conflict militarily exhausted and economically dependent, the ideal scenario for a China that wanted a subordinate partner supplying cheap energy, not an ally with autonomous military capability. This is not merely a regional crisis. It is the first real test of who controls the demographic military balance of Eurasia in the 21st century. And the outcome of that test will redraw the map of global power for decades. What Zelensky promised as a brutal response will, in the coming weeks, take concrete operational form. most likely in the form of precision strikes against Russian military infrastructure at ever greater depth, using Western long-range systems whose authorization for use has been progressively expanded over recent months. But the real strategic question those 528 bodies left open is not whether Ukraine will be able to inflict sufficient damage to force a negotiation. It is whether both sides will simultaneously reach the point of demographic exhaustion before any decisive territorial victory materializes, and who, Washington, Beijing, or Brussels, will hold the most influence over the moment when the arithmetic of the dead finally imposes itself upon the rhetoric of the living. And that moment was drawing closer. If this conflict is redrawing the rules of who lives, who dies, and who decides when to stop, the question that remains is, what number will be enough to change the calculus? Leave your analysis in the comments and subscribe to follow every development of this war that has not yet revealed its most decisive chapter.